Common writing problems and how to defeat them. For this week, we'll look at 5 common writing problems and how you can clean up your own manuscript to avoid them. Dead wood. There are words we use reflexively that slow down our prose unnecessarily. Wood is one of the most common. For instance, on the way to the academy each morning, Fritz would stand on the bridge and drop stones into the water. Better, on the way to the academy each morning, Fritz stood on the bridge and dropped stones into the water. Common dead wood words are would, just, that, then, really, very. In almost every case, you can improve your work by doing a search for these words and cutting them. In the very rare case when you need them, they will have more meaning because they don't appear so often the reader stops paying attention to them. Suddenly something happened. The word suddenly is almost always a wasted word if you're writing well. If something interrupts the actions of a scene, that should be obvious to the reader because of the break in the action it causes. For instance, Fan rested by the creek, dandling her fingers in the cool water. Exhausted by the long day's walk, she began to doze. Suddenly, a boar roared out of the woods toward her, startling her to full wakefulness. Better, a boar roared out of the woods toward her, startling her to full wakefulness. Naming minor characters. When readers encounter a named character, they assume they will see that character again and need to remember them. A good rule of thumb is to use roles rather than names for characters who appear only in one scene. There are, of course, exceptions. For instance, let's say you're writing a character who is the sort of person who reads a waitress's name tag in order to make small talk, and it's important for the reader to know that. Here, you would use her name, but only in dialogue from that character. Example, Charles read the waitress's name tag. "Hey, Kathy, I'm Charles, and I will be your customer this evening." The waitress stifled a sigh and put on her best fake smile. POV slip. POV slip happens when we know a character's thoughts or feelings even though we shouldn't. This is common and for some reason easy for readers to spot but harder for writers to catch in their own work. Point of view. Third person omniscient. The narrator knows everything and can speak to every character's thoughts and feelings. Third person limited. The narrator only knows the main character's thoughts and feelings. First person. The main character is the narrator I and only knows their own thoughts and feelings and is perhaps unreliable. So, for instance, in a first-person POV story where me refers to the narrator, one could never have the sentence, "Daphne's stomach turned as she looked at me with disgust." You can only have, "Daphne looked at me with clear disgust." Uncommon case, head hopping. While less common than other POVs, both science fiction and fantasy make more use of head hopping than other genres. Head hopping refers to a close third-person POV that changes between chapters. So one chapter may be written from character A's point of view and the next from character B's point of view. Here, the rules for close third apply within the chapter, so the narrator can only know what the main character of the chapter is thinking or feeling. Elephant, 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 elephant. Have you ever said a word so many times that it loses its meaning? That's called semantic satiation, and it happens when we read too. In fact, for unusual words, it can happen after only 2 to 3 repetitions that are too close together. Why this happens is fascinating, and I encourage you to read up on it, but for now, just trust me that it does. Here is an example using a name. John sat under the tree and listened to the birds. One seemed to John to be slightly off key. John picked up a pine cone and tossed it in the direction of the sour notes. Better. John sat under the tree and listened to the birds. One seemed to him to be slightly off key. He picked up a pine cone and tossed it in the direction of the sour notes. Do you see why that's better? Interestingly, some words, like conjunctions and definitive articles, are exempt from this. Brain science is fascinating. No matter how many times you write the The reader will never experience semantic satiation as long as you've used it correctly in a sentence. A good rule of thumb is not to repeat a meaning-making word within the same sentence unless absolutely necessary, and if possible, not to repeat it more than twice in a paragraph. For this final draft, you'll be trying to weed out these problems in your own draft and then peer reviewing one another's class members' work to see if you can help them weed it out as well. Pay careful attention to this week's directions, which are different than the directions for previous weeks. After this peer review, I will be the one giving feedback on the next two drafts of your story, the next draft and the final one that you turn in as part of your final portfolio. I'll send written feedback, but I encourage you to make an important appointment for a Skype conversation with me as well. Next week, I'll put up a sign-up sheet. Happy editing!